Welcome to EternalJourney, the podcast.
What is up, everyone? Welcome to EternalJourney, the podcast that talks about all things eternal with a focus on limited play. I'm your host, Jedi, and this week is episode 80 of the podcast, where we are going to help you build a deck. That's right. This show is going to be on how to build a deck for all you brewers or aspirational brewers out there. First things first, I want to welcome on the show my good friends every week, John.
Yo.
Alex.
How's it going, guys?
Hey.
And we have two special guests here today to help us do this. These are two brewers that are constantly in the Discord and on Team EternalJourney, helping people tune their decks, build them on their own, and just making all these cards out of nowhere win games that no one even knew they were anything other than Draft Shaft. Well, welcome first on the show, Sakarnen, aka Darthenos. Welcome, friend.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
And coming up across the ocean, or pond, I guess they call it a pond, across the pond, staying up way too late, I want to welcome Cal Shadowstep. What's up, buddy?
Good, very early morning, everyone.
So, a couple of housekeeping things real quick before we get started. You can catch us live at twitch.tv/Jedi_EJ every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday. And if not, check us offline at EternalJourney on YouTube. That includes the video version of this podcast. Shoutouts. Want to give a couple of shoutouts to people. First off, shout out to everyone that has ongoing support to the channel, both through listening, through comments, through all the good stuff you guys do for the community. Thank you guys so much for just contributing week after month. A couple of people want to highlight this week. Mercurial Blue with some huge bit donations this week. Really do appreciate all the support that you do, buddy. Fellow streamer, definitely throwing out positivity both on Discord, on his stream, and everywhere else. Looking out for people, sending some good vibes your way, my man. Thank you so much. Martholorax coming in with the 3-month sub, earning their Jedi lightsaber, along with Sizzle Steam, also hitting that Covenant 3-month mark. Thank you guys for your ongoing support and hang out with me, helping me draft better. Want to give a personal shout out to Shab, not only being a top ranked drafter, but also throwing down his second draft article on Eternal Warcry that you can catch now, talking about drafting control decks with some cards that people might not be valuing high enough, but his decks definitely are, and he is taking them to much success. Like I said, being a top ranked drafter. Speaking of a top-ranked drafter, Direwolf finally announced the Eternal Draft Championship, which is something we're all excited about. If you have a minimum of 5 DCP points in your profile, you are qualified to participate in this, and then anyone that had 80 points or more is able to bypass day 1 and has a bye immediately into day 2. But for further details on this, Alex, why don't you break it down for our listeners?
Yeah, so 34 people had the 80 points. I was just shy. I think, Jedi, you were just shy, and there might be some shenanigans at work with that. I don't know if you ever went back and looked at your points or whatever, but yeah, 34 people that had 80 points are already going to make it to day 2, so they have a bye. So the rest of us who have to battle on... Let's see, it starts on Saturday, August 29th at 9 Mountains time or 15 UTC, and it runs through Saturday, August 29th at 9 p.m. So you have, the 12 hours to do your 3 drafts. Is that right? Players must have at least 5 draft championships, points to qualify. They close sharply at 9 p.m. on the same day. Let's see here. You can compete your games at any time during that time. There's no benefit or penalty for playing early, late, or throughout. But I would assume the tiebreaker thing would happen with this too. What do you guys think? Where if you play folks that have a better record, it might help your tiebreaker. So you might want to consider that about when you play. They are saying please play you play early enough to ensure that you have enough time. Draft games can go till there's no cards left in your deck, so it could be a really long draft match. You play 3 7 draft runs for a total of 21 games. That's like unlike a normal draft where you would just stop at 3 losses. This is just going to let you finish out your 7 games because you need a total of they need 21. I think the total is going to be 21 games totals and like maybe 18 to get into day 2. Hopefully, something like that. All games are single elimination. That's normal, and then the best records will join the other 34 for day 2 madness on Sunday. I'm just looking at trying to play some good draft games, do some good drafts, and try to play as mistake free as possible. And yeah, just have fun with it because I don't know. That's why I'm here to play drafts. So I'm excited.
Some additional details to consider is the fact that all the cards that you draft you will be able to keep, so you get essentially 3 drafts worth of free cards just for participating. So I do encourage absolutely everyone to participate. The other thing is that most of the better drafters already made day 2, so like Alex said, there's 34 players that already qualified into day 2. So I really do encourage, if you have it, it's free cards, free shift stone, or just a good time. Come out there and participate, and it might encourage Direwolf to do more of it in the future. The price
there's no buy-in, right? It's if you qualified by having got Masters at least 1 month, then you get to play in the tournament, right? You don't have to buy in with any gold or any gems. Is that correct?
Correct.
It's like, yeah, there's do it. Even if you're gonna just rare draft it, go in there and get your cards. Don't not do it.
At the very least, if you just participate in it, you will also get an additional 3 packs, 200 card back points for your expedition card back if you're interested in that, and then 1 premium legendary. So triple incentive to just play in this. The last thing I do want to mention is for this tournament specifically, the top 4 in the tournament will get an invitation to Worlds, unlike the constructed side of it. So realize that not only first place but second as well as third and fourth place in this tournament get the invitation to Worlds to compete, and that is absolutely huge. But yeah, overall, once again, bunch of incentives to participate in it, completely free if you've qualified already. But okay, that is all the announcements we have today, which will take us to our pack 1 pick 1 for the week. So our guests, you guys are going to go up first. I'll go through the whole pack and you guys tell us which is your pick. Starting off, we have Spellbound Ursine, the 3/3 bear for 5. Darkfire is the deal damage equal to an enemy equal to the highest attack among your units. You have Double Shadow's Lifesteal for slow spell for 5 as well. Storm Prowler, we're not going to talk about. I still think that card is bad. Chemical Rounds is the deal 2 damage to slow speed for 1. Valley Clan Sage is in Shab's article, but I will move on. We have Battery Mage, the 5/3 for 5. Vorpal Cutter is the 1/3 Decay Rogue for 3 that when it attacks, she gets attack this turn equal to the highest attack among your other units. Seed of Creation, we're not too worried about right now. Combray Vow is you can discard a Time or Justice Sigil from your deck to gain influence of that type, and you take 1 damage. Frontline Volunteer, aka Cass, is the 3/4 warrior for 3 Justice. If you have double Fire Influence, he has Quick Draw. If you have double Primal Influence, he has Overwhelm. Grave Robbery is the pay 3 and a shadow for a fast spell that has Void Bound. Sacrifice a unit to draw a card of your choice from the enemy void. And then our rare is Master Conjurer. This is a 1/5 mage for 3 time. When Master Conjurer attacks, gain a Primal Influence. You have 6 Primal Influence. When you play your second spell in a turn, play a 4/4 Storm Dancer with flying. Sakarnen.
Sure. There are, let's see. There's probably like 4 cards that I would consider. Like I would look at the Chemical Rounds, the Battery Mage, and the Ursine. But for me, the pack one pick one would be Frontline Volunteer, just because it's a 3-cost 3/4, so it passes the vanilla test. It has pretty good stats, and it slots into 2 really good decks. So you could be Rakana, whatever flavor of Rakana you want to be, or you could stick it in as a really good 3-drop in Huru.
All right, nice. Cal?
So if we move past the fact that I'm probably the person on the team that drafts the least, so I'm obviously just rare draft. I'm not super high on Conjurer. I think the deck that wants Conjurer is probably Feln, and that is just very awkward. I'm probably on volunteer again. Like I'm looking at the chemical rounds, that's fine. I don't hate Vocal Cutter, but I'm not first picking it. Volunteer being a 3/4 means it eats most of the Prism Golems. It eats Thorn Beast. It brawls well with stuff like Caravan Guard. I think Justice is good anyway. Like even something like Argenport, I'm quite happy playing Frontline Volunteer Cass. I'm pretty high on Huru in general, so like that's an added buff. Yeah, I think I'm just taking a 3-mana 3/4 to be honest.
Yeah, no, that's completely defendable. Alex, what about you, buddy?
Pretty much on the same sheet of music that these boys are on. 3/4 for 3 and a color that I like. Otherwise, it's a pretty boring pack, so I think the volunteer is the pick for me.
All right, John, closing us off.
I think these guys have said it all. I also would take the Frontline Volunteer for this pick.
Yep, Frontline Volunteer. It's just a solid card all around for sure. All right, that's our pack one pick one for this week. So now to drop into our main topic. Today we are going to be, of course, as mentioned earlier, discussing how to build the deck. And so, starting off, we want to throw out the disclaimer that there's absolutely nothing wrong with net decking. Not everyone out there is a brewer. I simply pretend to be one. I think I know what I'm doing. I brew a deck and it's absolutely atrocious. So if you don't have the time to invest into testing, into working out kinks, or developing a deck around a card you want to play, simply going to Eternal Warcry and seeing what other people are doing in similar archetypes and decks is 100% perfectly all right, even though the internet has a bit of a negative connotation on it. Cal, you have some more to add on this. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, it's despite it kind of having this negative stereotype, you've kind of got to remember that like the only reason that metagames function is because a large proportion of the players metagame and play and net deck things. Like the reason we can look at a metagame and say, this is the boogeyman, this is what we need to beat, these are the top 3 decks, are because there's enough data because that many people net deck. It's not a thing that should be frowned upon. It's a necessary and pretty vital thing for a game to be healthy.
Nice. And of course, it once again gets it to the ability where it actually helps the community in a way where people that might not have the necessary resources to on their own increase their own competitive level, this kind of brings them up a level to that edge. If I explain that correctly, I feel like I got tongue tied. Long story short, it allows the community as a whole to become more competitive and on an even playing field where now you can really test your skill set. The other thing it does as well is for new players that have a limited amount of shiftstone, instead of sitting there trying to figure out what to craft or burning shiftstone on cards that aren't good, they can go and see what some of the top decks are and be like, oh, well, I like this card. That's a legendary I don't mind crafting. And so they can kind of really be efficient with how they use their shiftstone. All right, so that's our disclaimer, which means we're going to dive into the process between deck building. The first thing is, why do you brew? Like, what's the inspiration? What is the reason for you to brew instead of just kind of taking whatever deck or the best you can do with the cards that you have, which is totally fine. First one is self-expression. People get to essentially build a deck that shows off their thing. For example, Cal, I know you could not wait to brew around the what's the name of it now? The Eye of Winter card, the 5/6 or 5/8 that you got.
Guardian of Spring.
Yeah, exactly.
I love Guardian of Spring. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's one form of motivation to brew a deck, is essentially that there's a card that you just want to play with. I do the same thing. I look at a card, I'm like, oh man, I can't wait to play this card. So I'm going to brew a deck that facilitates playing that card. Another thing is just the fun factor. It kind of goes hand in hand with the self-expression, but if there's some kind of archetype that you enjoy, you think combo is really fun, or for example, batteries that we just recently had on the show, he loves having decks that take 80 million actions in one turn. So he builds those kinds of decks that are fun for him to play that someone else might not necessarily play. I, for example, can have a certain ceiling on that. I enjoy decks that have interaction, have things to do per turn, but once it goes over maybe 5 actions per turn, my brain fries and I can't handle the deck. So there's that. The other form is just research. Some people like exploring other cards. Kilibovich is a big one of this that kind of goes into this one and our next reason, which is he does the research. He goes looking at decks, finds out how he can make cards work that people might not be using or might have used in a long time. Loco Pojo is another one that does this as well, and Why I Salty are all brewers that they essentially do the research. They find like, hey, is this card good or not? Can this card be competitive? Can this card be good against Gauntlet? The one that goes hand in hand with this as well is the challenge factor, which again, going back to what I just said previously, you're looking at cards that people are, oh, that's unplayable, or there's no way you could play that in the meta, and you try to make it work. You take bad cards or cards that people might not be high on, or just cards that you think is fun even though it's not seen play, and challenge yourself to make a deck work around that card. These are the kinds of things that kind of start the snowball rolling down the hill of why do you want to brew? You need to have a reason to, versus just like, I'm bored, I'm going to put some things together. John, do you have anything particularly to add? What motivates you to brew decks?
I mean, you covered all the good ones, except for like I also do the thing you just said, which is, hey, I'm bored. I think I'm just gonna brew some decks. Like I just love brewing. I just the act of making decks is fun for me.
Okay, well, let's go with that. You're bored, you want to brew a deck. Let's go into step one, which is the first thing you need to do to point you in the right direction as far as building your deck. So, John, what are the things you look at before you even start putting a deck together? What motivates you to starting that process?
A lot of times it'll just be like an idea, like an interaction between two cards a lot of times, or maybe just like one card I saw like, ahead of time of a set release, and I've just been like thinking about it for a week or something, just either just an idea or a card or, any of those I think are fine starting places.
Okay, yeah. So for John, you identify a card that you want to build around, or like you said, an interaction, right?
Yeah, a lot of times for me, it's an interaction. Yeah.
So that's the cornerstone for your deck building, and yeah, that's where you start, right? If you're going to build a building, you need to start at a foundation, and you identify that one piece is what you want to have the deck around. Let's send it over to you, Saka. What is your step one when you look into deck building?
So I would say that the step one of each of my decks would be to identify my win condition. Sometimes it'll be like a suite of specific cards. So maybe it'll be something like Rollant Maiden and Backbreaker, for instance. Or it could be card advantage, so removal and Helio. Or it could be some kind of a combo deck. So yeah, so I just think that the first step is to identify, at least for me, is to identify how you're going to win the game.
Okay, nice. All right, Cal, what is your cornerstone for deck building?
I'm usually trying to find something relatively degenerate to do. And it doesn't necessarily have to be. I'm quite a mid-range player, so it doesn't necessarily have to be degenerate in the sense that something like Talea combo is, where you're yeeting your entire deck and killing them. But it's usually something like, what's the most powerful set of cards I can put into a curve, and how does new cards fit into that and change what colors and what cards I might place at different parts of the curve. The big example I'd use is I spoke recently about one of my favorite cards being Vargo, and the curve of something like Merchant into Vargo into Harsh Rule into Sight. That's even though it's put into a mid-range shell, it's a very degenerate thing to try and do. It's a very, very, very powerful curve. And that sort of what parts fit together to create this curve of a game plan, I think, is where I usually put focus on deck building.
Got you. Okay, yeah. So for the most part, the three of you like picking that one small part, that first step, and from there building everything else on top of that. The other angle you could take it are slightly wider or broader strokes, where you are looking the bigger picture to build your deck. This includes essentially picking an archetype that you are excited to play. For example, if Reanimator is something that you like, so you'll actually start with the fact that this is what my end game is, and so you begin to build your deck in almost reverse engineering it. For example, once again, if we're touching on that, you obviously want to see which reanimation spells, pulling cards from your void that you want to look at using. You want to see what are your payoffs, the cards specifically that you want to be reanimating and cheating on cost. And then finally, things that you want to do to put those units into your void. And another version is an aggressive archetype, right? You want to be low to the ground, and so you're going to start there and identify, cool, so I could stop looking at the 6, 7, 8 drops because that's not going to go in my deck. The other thing that is a little more on the competitive side but could easily transfer over to AI as well is when you're identifying the boogeyman of the format and essentially trying to build a deck to take it down, or the counter, you know, paper, rock, scissors, essentially. You see this a lot more in constructed formats in the competitive side. For example, if we go back when Jek was everywhere, the Barbarian Camp, I believe, was the team that figured out to make a deck where it just beat Jek. Why? Because it was bigger. All the units were bigger than Jek, doing the 4 damage. You can see this in Gauntlet. If there's a handful of Gauntlet decks that are essentially beating you, you can adjust your deck and modify it to defeat that, or just the pocket of the ladder you're in. Even if you're not working your way to Masters, if you're in silver or in gold and you see that there's a lot of XYZ deck, then and you play that 60-70% of the time of your ladder matches, you can take that broad picture and be like, okay, what do I need to do to essentially take down that deck, and then reverse engineer a deck from there.
It does make me think of the bread anagram for draft.
Sure.
Yes.
I do wonder if how much you can apply that to constructed as well. Like, do you start with your bombs? If you're mono red, do you start with what are the super impactful things? What are my Jack? What are my Milos? And then go on to, like, am I playing what am I removal? Am I playing Torch? Am I playing Seer? Am I playing Salvo? And then move down that in the same way.
I think that approach definitely works for just like, you know, any kind of average mid-range deck, but like constructed there's just so much more going on that's like maybe just it's just like a very basic way to do it, and I think it will work, but like I don't know, it's for the most part I think it's a little more complicated than that.
Well, I was thinking about how you'd apply it to something like Talir, and I think you can, but I'm not sure if it works because it works or if it works because I'm trying to think about it in a way that makes sure it works, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in a way, I can kind of see that working. Like John said, I could see that working pretty well with mid-range decks, like he said. But I think that there might be some things that you end up missing out on if you use that approach to deck building. Although I think it could work, like to a certain extent.
All right, so we have our step 1. We have what starts you down the path. The next thing is that you have a shell, right? As we've established in this first section, you're not building an entire deck just yet. You're finding that cornerstone and you're starting to build around it. So you have the foundation laid, you have the skeleton of your deck, right? How much of your deck is enabled by your game plan, or enables your game plan, right? Callan, you could take lead on this one. So, for example, you want to do degenerate things, right? So you can't, your entire deck is not going to do degenerate things. You're going to have a handful or a skeleton of the deck, maybe a third of it or a quarter of it, that really facilitates that degeneration. And then the rest of the deck is going to help that game plan. So how does that break down? How do you start building cards around the skeleton, essentially adding the muscle tissue and sinew and whatnot to your skeleton of a deck?
Sure. So you, like you said, if we're starting off with, you know, let's say a quarter of the deck being like this nebulous win condition or whatever, the rest of the deck needs to help you survive to the point where you get to do that, and do that, you know, over the course of many games consistently. So, you know, you'll want to consider just basic things in all card games, deck building, pretty much, right? Like the mana curve. In this game, it's called the power curve. You know, what kind of influence you need and when. Whether your win con is going to be main deck or in the market, because the market is a huge part of this game. Which format it's for, and you know, which of those things are even available in that format. You'll want to start with, like, typically your early game plan needs to either be unit based or removal, or like in the absence of that being your early game plan, you could maybe just set up and dirtle and like kind of churn through if you're doing more like a combo deck, and then just rely on like big board wipes kind of in the middle, turns like turn 4, 5, 6 range. That could be another approach, but you need to have some way to make it to where things cannot happen on time, as planned, and you'll still survive to execute your game plan.
Okay. Yeah, I like how you threw in power bases and curve considerations, because that's definitely a thing as well. We talked about it a little bit with Sunnyvale at the end of last week's show, where you can easily get clogged up with all of a sudden you're not paying attention. You're like, this is a good card, this is a good card. And then wow, my 4-drop slot is super crowded and congested. And that can make the deck quite clunky. Cal, do you care to elaborate on that?
I think that the slower your deck is, the less it needs a focused game plan. If you take like the extremes being something like mono red, everything has to do damage, everything has to put pressure on, everything has to try and kill your opponent by turn 4. Combo decks like Talair, like the Waystone combo, everything has to be to get your key piece to go off as quickly as possible. The further you get towards the sort of control end, the more you can kind of just find a win condition. I'm quite guilty of enjoying these decks. The decks that don't really have as focused a game plan. You just have some removal, a lot of ways to draw cards, and some ways to probably win the game. And if you draw enough cards and kill enough things, you'll probably find them at some point and just kind of get there. And that's much less of a focused approach. You don't really need to put as much emphasis on making your deck do one thing very, very well. And you can kind of just have a little bit more freedom.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's if your game plan is essentially to do something on turn 7 and 8, then you're not as hard pressed to get that sweet curve in the early games. You have time to dig. So it makes sense.
Like if your game plan is to end the game on turn 20 with a Channel of the Tempest for 18, then you can kind of just durdle the rest of the time. You don't need to put anything particular in your deck other than a way to get that Channel of the Tempest to eventually kill your opponent.
Now, there is the argument, though, there where if you draw potentially the wrong half of your deck, so to speak, you could just be dirtling around, like you said, spinning your wheels and not really making any progress either towards your win con or preventing your opponent from killing you. So how do you essentially negotiate that?
That's kind of the advantage of drawing cards, right? If you draw enough cards, you'll probably find most of it rather than just the one half. I really like strategize, okay? Don't judge me.
Sunnyvale was high on it last show as well, so why don't you give us your take on why strategize is so good?
It's just a sacrifice in time in order to make sure you draw the cards that you need to continue the game as long as possible. And if that was power, then you might draw too much power, and if that was not power, you might get power screwed. But cantrips like that, like Wisdom of Elders, like Cull the Deck, allow you to use your life as a resource to smooth out your game to a point where you're turning the corner and making sure you're in control.
Okay.
In Throne specifically, I feel like there's also a lot of different that are actually kind of common corner case scenarios where being able to tuck something into your deck with strategize is actually really relevant. Like some things that come to mind would be like if you know you only run a certain number of sigils and you have Seeks, you want to maybe keep the Seeks alive for longer. Or if you're playing like a Kilo deck and you draw like a big Vara at a drama, you can just shift it away. So I think it's a really good card.
Saka, when building a deck, and you are quite the competitive player, how much of your deck, if any, or what archetypes do you give or offer some resources up to essentially adding potential countermeasures for the meta if there's things you're gonna plan on. I mean, obviously we're not playing a vacuum, we're not playing against just the AI that's gonna do the best play for what's a screenshot. You're going against other human beings that are gonna try to counter your strategy as well. So how much of that of your deck do you typically devote to that? Is that something you even consider, and how do you go about that?
I think it's a bit of a cop-out answer to say, but my short answer is it depends. Like you mentioned before, like with pocket metas, if there's like something that you see a lot of and you can counter easily, like let's say a lot of people are playing like a monofaction deck, for instance, like maybe you would want to consider running more removal than you normally would, just so you could slot in annihilates. Um, I probably don't go over. I think the most I would play in a deck would probably be something like 12 12 ways to interact with the opponent, and with the etchings and with the merchants and stuff you can kind of cheat on that as well, so I'd say up to 12 cards.
Okay, and since you mentioned it and John mentioned it earlier, is your default to put those cards in the market, or do you start with them in the main deck, or is it another it kind of depends thing?
I think in each of my markets I usually have at least one form of removal, sometimes two, but it's usually just one.
Okay, fair enough. Cal, speaking of meta games, how do you make this balance?
It depends on part of it. If it, in terms of like how much do you want to fill your deck with things that don't necessarily quote unquote advance your game plan, but are trying to counter your opponents. Again, it depends what sort of archetype you're playing, whether you're a deck that needs to be the one that is being reacted to, or whether you are a deck that has more options and more ways to sort of play along the game and not necessarily try and just kill your opponent because you can't afford to play answers. In terms of like markets, I think it very much depends on how many cards you're likely to see. And I think there's kind of quite kind of an idea that your market should always look similar. Like it should always have a piece of removal. It should always have a bomb. It should always have something's integral to your game plan. And that's not necessarily true because some decks are going to be able to see their markets more consistently because they're just going to see more cards. I think a deck like Stone Scar should never really be putting cards in their market that they rely on for their game plan because you're only going to see like 11 or 12 cards in an average game. Whereas if you look at something like Huru is probably going to see 30, 40 cards in an average game. So that just by seeing 4 times the amount of cards, you can have cards in your market that you wouldn't normally have just because you know you're going to see them. If that makes sense.
Yes, yes, it does. Yeah.
So one thing I was going to point out is in terms of like attacking a meta, there's this idea of like levels of metagaming where you have a level 0. So like if I was going to use the recent Rakano tragedy as an example, where like your level 0 is you have this deck that is quite clearly the best deck, and then you have a couple of decks that are designed to beat the best deck, and then your level 2 is then the decks that you're brewing to try and beat the decks that people are building to beat Rakano. And like there's no correct level of metagaming to decide to put yourself in. It's very much like a personal choice. Like they're not ATQs, the Summer Challenge, where Rakano was obscene. Like I had the option of taking Rakano to this, but going into it, I know that I'm less practiced than everybody else playing Rakano, so I could try and interact in level 0 of this metagame, but I'm going to be in the worst tier of this. So then, like, if I know I'm not interacting in this level, do I want to interact in level 1 and play something that I think is going to beat Rakano, or do I want to interact further along the line And like this can, in theory, go on forever, but it usually doesn't. But like, yeah, there's just this. You need to decide at what point you need to stop and go. This is what I want to beat, whether it's the best deck or the second best deck or the third best deck or whatever. It's something you need to decide during deck building. Before you even think about like your curve or your mana or whatever, you need to decide at what point you want to try and attack the metagame. If that makes sense. I probably say if that makes sense more often than I should.
I end up stop saying it because half the stuff I say doesn't make any sense, not even to me. So I think you're making more sense than I do. John, you're really good about this next thing, which is essentially dusting off old cards. You're looking back at your collection, cards that might have seen some time in the sun in previous metas or formats, and they fell out of favor, and all of a sudden they may essentially be good again if someone just took the time to look at them. And then plus, obviously, if you already used the shift stone or you got lucky opening packs to get these cards, you can find some additional applications for it. Once again, I've found you to be really good about this, constantly looking for old diamonds in the rough. You want to go touch a little on this?
Yeah, I don't think I do that like specifically or like intentionally. Like I'm not like a beta player of Eternal or anything. Like, I started about the same time you did, Jedi, right? Like almost the end of set 4, I think it was. So like I guess like really what this says to me is not that I'm so much dusting off old cards, but like I'm like willing to give anything a chance. Like I don't just say I don't like immediately discount like swaths of cards when I go into brewing. I'll like identify my strategy, identify my colors, and I'll literally look at like every card available to me and consider them. I think that's how I end up maybe finding some of these useful old cards, and I think this particularly applies to the expedition format, because I think the format's designed for some of these cards that we're kind of talking about to shine there, where they've never really had their time in the spotlight. And so like for some people, some of these will be like old favorites that they've never really gotten to play with, and I think that's a great place to look for brewing.
Excellent. Yeah, and that goes, you just touched on the next point as well, so great segue there, is just the fact that look at cards that have never been played before. Sometimes they just needed a new card to be added to the format for this older card to finally have the synergy it needed to become a contender, and that could be what you need to complete your deck. Maybe if it's not the 100% top level of exactly what your deck wants to be doing, but if it could help that, facilitate that, or at least get you there, then it could be a thing. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people normally do when new cards come out, is be like, okay, what other cards can go with this synergy? And all of a sudden, a card that no one ever played can become extremely playable. We definitely
and Jedi, like, this is a thing that's not easy for people to do, like, because you have to craft cards to test them, right? So like one way to kind of to get around this, I know you talk about this all the time, is like, if you want to try a card, just put it as a one of in your market, not like considering that like a permanent market slot, just like a way to kind of play as if you have access to it more often, like as if you're running 4 copies main deck. It'll help you like see whether or not that's a card worth exploring. And like, yeah, there's like a ton of, obviously they're releasing new cards all the time. People like just haven't tried all these cards out. Like, a card will speak to somebody and they'll go brew a deck, and that'll like become not necessarily part of the meta, but it'll just be out there and you'll see it. And like, there's just not, this is the people, that the audience for this game is not like huge. So we're not like seeing every single archetype being explored immediately. You know what I mean? Like, there's just not enough enough people to find everything out that quickly. Like, I think people are still discovering things as the new sets released from the old set, cards that are good, or maybe like maybe they just become better obviously when new cards come out too. That's another thing. But yeah, some of those new cards, like, just because you haven't seen them in a deck doesn't mean you should just discount them from considering for your deck.
And there's also ways to improve on someone else's deck. Sometimes people post a deck that could be the first or second iteration of a deck, and you might attack it a different way, adding a different faction or swapping out some cards to keep that core purpose of the deck, but repurpose it, I guess, because English is hard, to fit a different means. We saw that a lot with the variations of Carver decks. I think over the course of Carver's stint, there was 5 different variations of the deck because people were adding different things to it, taking out different things and adjusting the game plans. At one point, obviously, the Boxer finished off with it being a 5-color animal of a deck where he piloted it like a champion. So that's something to consider. What else? Other things you could do to finish filling out your deck include things. There's defensive speed, there's defense we've talked about. If your deck's trying to get into that late game, then you have to identify how to facilitate getting to that late game. And so you're looking at things like board wipes. Can your deck use board wipes? If you have a lot of creatures that are units that are going to help you gum up the board, then board wipes are not your thing because they're going to do as much damage to you as your opponent. Vice versa, if you look and you don't have a lot of units, then you might be looking at board wipes. More low to the ground aggro decks, they're not going to want to play those 4 and 5 cost removal spells because that really messes up their curve. And so they're going to look towards those 1 and 2 cost removal spells, hopefully trying to be as efficient as possible, filling in the gaps as they're going up their curve. Another thing to that as well is identifying how high you want your curve to go. If you're trying to play 7 and 8 cost spells or units, then you have to make sure your power base can facilitate that versus, hey, my curve tops off at 4. So now you could start trimming on power, figuring out what can replace that power. And that's how you start to kind of fill in the gaps in the deck around that core skeleton or shell of a deck that you have going on. Just for clarification purposes, what John was talking about for our newer players, obviously there's multiple ways that you can access the market with merchants, smugglers, etchings, and the instant speed spells that allow you access to a market as well. So what John is saying is if you don't have the shiftstone to craft 4 of a card, you can essentially just craft 1 of a legendary, put that in the market, and then if you have the, let's say for example, 4 smugglers and 4 etchings, now you essentially have 8 copies of that legendary you can see more often in your deck, so you get an idea of whether that is something that you do want to craft 4 of and put in your deck or not. Cal, you had something to add?
Yeah, I was going to say in particular is quite common at the moment with the transposed broker markets, where you have 4 real market cards, and your last market card is broker, and then your main deck 4 copies of transpose are also an equivalent to your broker, which is also equivalent to 4 main deck copies of any one of your other 4 market cards.
Yeah, very good point. I like that. That's some good tech. I'm not running Primal right now, so that's why I probably don't have that in any of my decks, but I do like that idea where you essentially end of turn, transpose, get broker, then the following turn broker to put whatever else into your deck. I like that. And it gives you the face ages.
That's your mistake. Primal's the best color. You should definitely just be playing Primal.
Sweet hot take. You heard it here first. Okay, so go ahead, Sokka.
And it's really relevant specifically in Expedition and in the World Pyre decks because you can just make it so transpose. I mean, obviously you have to have played the Pyre first, but it makes it so that every transpose you have is just a way to get a 4-drop on the board and also to shuffle in the copies of 8 of the Huru. So it's also just like a way to put in a 12 cost win condition in a deck that can't really play it until they can cheat it out. So like you're kind of saving it for the right moment to play it.
The last thing I want to add, going back to power base, because I do think the most important thing in deck building is to make sure that your deck actually functions and you can play your cards, is the more colors you add or the more factions you add, then the influence requirements are going to go up, and that is something serious to look at as well. That's another way to kind of trim the deck, which we'll talk about here in a moment, is looking, if you're trying to run tri-faction and all your cards require 4 and 5 influence, that's going to be extremely difficult to pull off. So you want to go back down and see, okay, I want these 2 colors to be my primary, so I can go a little heavier on that. How do I adjust my power base? Do I run Seeks? Do I run Petitions? Do I run the Vows to get that splash color in, etc., etc.? But I think that is something else to look at, because that will tell you, hey, I might not be able to run this 5 influence card in my deck. And that's another way to adjust and fill out the rest of your deck.
I think Throne would like a word with you, because I don't think Throne agrees with you at all. With the easy capability of casting Upsat on turn 4 and OG Tazbu on turn 5, I think in Throne, unless you're playing 4 colors, Influence is pretty much just a joke. Like, it's quite easy to play these 5 color or 5 copies of A legendaries alongside like Jack in an off color and whatever else in the other color. I think in Expedition it's definitely a thing you have to consider, where you don't have as many dual powers. And like, okay, so it would be wrong of me to say it's not a consideration. It's just, if you're clever with your deck building and you're willing to make some concessions, then I don't think it's really a question of influence in Throne anymore. I think this is a fundamental problem with Throne as a format.
All right. Well, no, that's exactly what we're here to help people build those decks and help them adjust to if they want to do some 5 color greed pile, then they can. So I'm glad you mentioned it. So now that you have your deck made, you designed it, you came up with some stuff, you put the cards in that you want. This has all been theory crafting. So now it's time to test the deck, to fine tune it for what you want it to do, to make sure the game plan that you had or the idea you had for this deck can work. Now, granted, I will throw in another disclaimer. Sometimes it does not work. I've done it plenty of times where I'm like, oh, this is great synergy. This is so much value. And then I play it and be like, well, I've played 20 games and I've gone off one time. So maybe this is not a thing. So testing is really important, where you're finally putting the rubber meets the road and you're putting pen to paper and testing out your game plan and seeing what happens. Obviously, there's multiple ways of testing. You have things that you can test against the AI for Gauntlet. You can go on the actual ladders. You can play casual, the casual format where you may or may not identify other competitive decks on there. And then you obviously have just friends that you can get on there on your friends list and play test with them, specific matchups, or just in general, both you can brew decks and battle each other out. Sending it over to you, Saka. What's your preferred method of testing and why?
Oh, well, it depends on the format. If it's an expedition, I kind of just want to make sure that the deck can actually, function, like it'll still curve out and stuff. So I'll just give it a gauntlet run and see how it feels. And after that, I'll usually just take it into ladder. If it's in preparation for like an ECQ or a challenge, I would probably just ask somebody else from the EternalJourney to test it out. But usually I just take it to ladder. And with Throne, a lot of the decks, like a lot of the cores of a lot of different meta decks, have just kind of been the same. So just by looking at it, you can kind of tell, like, can this deck deal with, like, I don't know, like Milos on 3, Jack on 4? Can this apply enough pressure against like a Talir or a Reanimator deck? Like, just considerations like that.
Okay. Now, John, how do you like to test?
Basically in the same ways that Sokka just mentioned, with the exception of, I find like I'll still do it when I am kind of multitasking and I don't want to subject another human to random roping. I'll use Gauntlet, but like for Expedition in particular, I find Gauntlet to be not ideal, because the AI does some unfair things that like maybe on par with what people are not the same strategies, but like power level wise on par with like Throne decks anyway. So like that's the only thing I do a little different, is like I'll just go straight into the Expedition casual queue or something if I'm really unsure about a fresh deck idea or something.
Okay.
I find the Gauntlet to be fine for testing Throne, basically, because like Sokka said, like the meta is like a relatively known quantity. You can just kind of theory craft, like, what do I have for this? What do I have for this? Can I beat this? And then like you can test against those speeds, like extremely fast aggro and extremely big like time decks, for example, like versus the AI. Like they kind of they span that entire gap. So that's a reasonable place for Throne testing.
Yeah, I definitely do think that you bring up a very good point as far as testing against multiple archetypes as well, because it's very easy to be, if you go down the route of attacking the meta, and let's say you make this awesome deck that just steamrolls Rakano when it was in its glory, but you lose to everything else, well, then the deck could be just as frustrating as just a deck that loses to Rakano. So I do think it's important to test the full gamut.
Yeah, and in that case, right, you go to ladder and all you play is Rakano, you're like, man, my deck is amazing. And then like, if you're prepping for a big tournament and everyone comes prepared to beat that deck, and you're very weak to everything else, well, yeah, I mean, maybe you would have noticed that if you ran through the gauntlet a couple times, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, right? Even if you're just a gauntlet player, you build this deck that's super great against all the aggressive decks that Gauntlet has, but then when you go up against those one or two decks that just go all spells or goes really big or all relics, and you're just like, WTF, mate.
Yeah.
Cal, you are very good about keeping track of what's going on. You have a log sheet that you keep track of number crunching and whatnot. How important is that, and how much of it do you go off of gut feeling on some of your decisions on cards and things like that? How crucial is the fact that you keep track of all your stuff, actually writing it all down?
I log everything, but I don't usually. I have in the past tried to run sort of statistical analysis on like these data sheets, but the consensus and Frank Karsten, who's an MTG player, does quite a lot of articles on this, which are worth checking out, even if you're an Eternal player, on these like statistics. The beginning of when a data set becomes statistically relevant is when you've played a brew versus a specific matchup. It's something like 170 times or something. And I don't have usually the time to play 170 games against for every brew that I make. So a lot of it is gut instinct. A lot of it is like, okay, well, this record's 10-2 against this deck. That's probably pretty good. Yeah, I'll make a few tweaks here and there, but it's probably okay. But not. I wouldn't do real number crunching. I would call it impractical to do real number crunching for anything that you're not spending months in advance planning for.
Okay. The next part I wanted to bring up is the flip side of that, and going off of your feeling. The reason why I like doing, especially when you are legitimately testing, I like keeping some type of documentation, because it's very easy to have a couple of bad stints and feel like something is worse than it actually is, or have a really big blowout that's going to stick in your mind and make a card overvalued in your mind, because you won't remember the 2 or 3 times that the card just rotted in your hand where it was doing nothing, but you will remember the time that it just completely blew out your opponent and won you the game. So I think it's very important to identify these moments, take them for what it's worth, and keep an accurate count, especially the things you are just keeping track of. The other flip side, or the other thing I do encourage, is I've seen some people, when they test, they play a game, move some cards, play a game, move some cards, play a game, move some cards. And I think that, much like going off of what you were talking about, is the small sample size. If a card underperforms one game, it's very difficult to consider that full-blown awesome accurate data and immediately start changing things. So I do think you want to get at least some reps in it over the course of a handful of games before you make a decision about cutting something. Sometimes it might not necessarily be cutting the card completely. Sometimes it might just be essentially trimming from 3 cards to 2, or 4 cards to 2, or something like that, or maybe just having one of them in the market, etc., etc. The other caveat to that as well is that you're looking at slight adjustments. So you don't want to play 3 games and swap out 8 cards, because that can completely change the fundamentals of your deck or the way certain cards are. For example, if you are running X amount of removal and you find out, like, you know what, I just have so much removal. This card, I normally have more removal than my opponents are playing units, and if I go up against a relic heavy deck, or a control deck, it's not doing much. If you go there and all of a sudden you swap out 8 removal spells, well, now you might have tip the scale too far in the other direction, and now you come to find out that you don't have enough removal. So I think it's better to maybe cut out 2-3 pieces of removal and then gauge that. If you still feel like you're having too much, then cut out 2 more. Or vice versa. If you're trying to get in with a unit, you're like, well, this unit has no problems getting in damage, so I don't need this much removal to make sure it gets in. And if you cut, I'm going overboard on it, but yeah, just small tweaks as you're adjusting instead of changing the complete fundamentals of a deck in one shot.
I was going to say that there's 2 points there that I would. One is that I like absolutely agree with you. Like if I'm playing a deck that I brewed for the first time, I won't change a card unless I've played sort of 10-15 games with it, just to get a feel for like the vague way the deck works. And it's only then that you're like, okay, well, maybe this removal spell is better than this one, and then I'll test another 10 games with it. And then, change, maybe like the curve is a bit high, I'll lower the curve a bit, test another 10 games with it. Like, you just can't get it with like one game. And the other thing I would say to people that are making these sort of adjustments regularly is that in most decks, you can always replace some of these with filtering. If you have too much removal, if it feels like you have too much removal, and then when you cut a couple, it feels like you have too little removal. If you replace the removal with some form of card draw, and even like Mono Red has this is it Impatient Pyromage? I want to say
Yes.
Kindling Carver. These sort of things are like, well, they're not actually removal. They are still things that you can put on board, but they also function to find your removal that you kind of cut for them. And the same goes with like Strategize, Color Deck, Wisdom the Elders, yada, yada, yada. It's usually, if it feels iffy and it feels like it's slightly inconsistent, then replacing it with some filtering is usually better than replacing it with other cards that perform similar roles or opposite roles.
That's one of the reasons why I'm such a huge fan of the new plunder cards. Like Desert Alchemist, it can act as removal, or it can turn excess power into a treasure trove. So I also like cards that are able to kind of facilitate that. And it's basically just Maveloth Huntress, the new the Primal Imbue 2-drop that has Killer, and Desert Alchemist.
All right, so the last thing I do want to mention when you're building your deck and you're making your fine-tune adjustments and stuff to really lock it into what you want the deck to do. First, you have to be okay with realizing sometimes it's just a bad deck. I hate to say that, but sometimes the cards aren't there to facilitate it, or the meta is just too aggressive or too controlly that it just doesn't facilitate that. You see that a lot when Pride Leader was a big deal, because every card that ran time ran Pride Leader, and there were some ways for aggro decks to get around it, but it was still a steamroll if they drew a couple of them. But it really stopped relic strategies because of the fact that all the time decks were just running it because it was a good efficient unit, and the fact that they had a main deck card that they were running a 4 of, that they could play at fast speed, that they didn't cost them anything to their deck building, that could immediately negate your strategy, essentially stopped a lot of relic decks from happening. So sometimes it does happen. Sometimes you just have to wait for your spot when the planets align for your deck to be legit. Another part of it is that maybe your deck as a whole is on point, but that fun card that you really wanted to put in just isn't cutting it. I am a victim of that with Hammerhand. I tried 18 different constructed decks to make Hammerhand work, and it just was too much. It wasn't there. The 5 damage wasn't really getting through enough, and I had to DX her or maybe cut down to a market or to 2 of or something like that. Cal, you want to elaborate some more on this?
You have to be able to step back and say that not all of the preconceptions are necessarily correct. I think we have a lot of bias towards these things that are proven to be efficient and things that are considered, anything else that is not that is just not really constructive playable. Like you have your like, oh well, Annihilate and Defile are what you expect from removal, and thus Death Strike is not constructive playable, even though like we see it kind of being played a little bit more now in Expedition because it fulfills a unique role. But it took people quite a long time to come around to it because it's just considered like oh, it's premium draft removal, but it's not good enough for constructed. And the same goes with these cards like Biting Winds. And you kind of need to be able to go, okay, well, maybe the game isn't in a state that we expect it to be, and be able to look at all the cards without necessarily looking into it with pre-constructed format goggles on.
I will end you guys with this note here is what's your goal of the deck? Your deck does not have to be perfect unless you're trying to be competitive. If you're trying to be competitive, then obviously you're going up against the best decks from other players, so yours has to be the best version you can make. But you are a casual person, just like kind of hanging out in silver and stuff like that on the ladder, playing from time to time, or you're playing versus the AI. Play the deck that you have the most fun with, because that's what it's all about. Your deck does not have to be super awesome. I've done it plenty of times where I've told people like, why is this card in here? I'm like, I'm on it. I'll be honest with you. I know there's probably better options, but this is the card I like playing with. So that's why I'm going to leave it. But you have to understand, you have to pay that price. So whenever you're complaining like, oh man, I get smashed every time I play this card, you know it. But if your goal is not to win 95% of your games, which is obviously unheard of, then that's perfectly okay. So once again, the thing that encompasses all things and all motivation for playing Eternal, make sure you are having fun. John does this all the time. He'll send a deck list my way, and I am smashing my head against the wall because it has literally a spreadsheet or a flowchart to figure out how to play it. But John is having an absolute delight playing it, and that's what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for our main topic, which means that takes us to our What's the Play. And as usual, we'll have our guest start off first. So, Saka, you'll be the first one with Hal on deck. Our What's the Play today? Our opponent is at 25 health. We are at 22 health. They are playing straight Praxis, and we are playing Corendon, which is Time, Justice, Shadow. They have 3 power of 5 open, and we have 5 power of 5 open. They have a Magnificent Stranger on the board, a Apprentice, I forgot what it is, Apprentice Mage, the 2/2 that ramps them, the 0/3 Chandra, which is the Fire Mage.
Lethal Firebrand.
Thank you, Firebrand. And then the 2/1 Machinist that when they play a spell of 5 cost or greater transforms into a Sentinel of that cost. In our hand, we have Nahid's Distillation. We have a Machinist of our own. We have a Battery Mage, the 5 cost 5/3 that ramps us. We have a Shadow Sigil that we cannot play this turn. And then a Disappear in hand. Of note, we are missing the 4th influence for Disappear. Our board has a Learned Herbalist. Starting off with you, Saka. What's your play here?
Okay, so my play here would probably just be going Machinist and then planning for playing Disappear next turn, so if we could hopefully get to Disappear. That also gains us a little bit of life with the Herbalist. Playing the Battery Mage is also a reasonable line because it can block the board pretty well. Actually, no, I'll change. I would probably just play the Battery Mage in this position, just because it looks really good on the board. You're able to negate the Mag Stranger's attacking abilities. You won't be able to do like a great, you won't be able to have a 5/5 on board next turn, but you'll be stronger on the you'll have a stronger board presence. I mean, you said they were Praxis, so you could be walking into like a Seer or some other kind of 3 damage spell, like Pillage. But outside of that, they can't really punish you. I mean, they could have like a teleport or something like that, but I don't think I don't think you need to play around it, considering the life totals.
Okay. Cal, you're up.
So, I think whatever good play we make is hoping that he doesn't have a 5-cost spell for Firebrand. I think most of the good lines here are not good against that. I'm leading off on Battery Mage because I want to try and set up to cast the Machinist and use it to cast Nahid's Distillation in the same turn. So I think we're hoping to play the Battery Mage, go to 6 power, next turn, play the power, go to 7, play Machinist, immediately cast and use distillation and make it into a 5/5.
Of note, we couldn't play our power. The 5 power. We played our 5th power this turn.
Yeah, but if we play Battery Mage this turn, we get to 7 playing a power next turn, which is Machinist plus Distillation.
Oh, okay, I got you. I see what you're saying. Okay, all right, fair. So you're on Battery Mage as well here?
Yeah.
John, what would you do here, buddy?
Yeah, you're in a tough spot. I like the way I think Cal said we're basically just dead. Everything looks kind of bad against this Firebrand plus any 5-cost spell from Boxer here. So I agree with Cal's play. Like I would just play the Battery Mage and set up for this growing this Machinist next turn with our mostly guaranteed, as long as the 5/3 survives the turn, right? Which, I mean, that's if it survives the turn, I think we're set up to pull ahead here with this distillation cast, and then what else we have going on here. So I think as long as we don't just get completely blown out by this Firebrand and a 5-cost spell next turn, I think we're set up okay.
See, so I actually did what all you guys said, which is play the Battery Mage here, but I think I was wrong, and I'll tell you why. You guys know my luck, and you know how I'm really good at identifying how we're going to lose. The fact that they're Praxis is the 5-cost spells matters deck, and the Firebrand will deal 3 damage anytime you cast a spell with 5. There's nothing in their void, which means that this is still early in the game. They've played every card in their hand so far. So I think there's a high chance that they have a 5-cost spell next turn that will trigger the 3 damage. Of course, that kills everything in our hand. It kills the Machinist, it kills the Battery Mage, and it kills the Herbalist. So I said the same thing. I tried to figure out between the two which one I would prefer to die, the Machinist or the Battery Mage, and I decided with you guys to go with the Battery Mage. But I actually think that because there was such a high chance of them playing the 5-cost spell next turn to not only trigger their Firebrand but also make their own Machinist a 5/5, I think it was really important for us to mitigate the damage that would do on our side of the board. And I think the correct play here actually is to just go ahead and burn the Distillation to draw extra cards that could lead us to an answer to either the 5/5 or the Firebrand. And then if they trigger Firebrand, the only thing they can kill is our Herbalist. And that way we still have access to the Machinist in a later date or a later time because we have the Disappear in hand to trigger as well. And our biggest unit that could potentially block their 5/5, the 5/3 Battery Mage, stays alive as well. What do you guys think?
I mean, I agree that they probably have a 5-cost spell, but like,
I don't think we can play around it.
Right. I don't know. Like, I think that's an interesting line, but I don't know. Like, I don't think that's the line I would go with.
Okay, no, good.
I'm excited to hear Alex's take on this one too.
All right, let's see here. This might be contrary to what you guys are going to do, but so you're in a pretty tough spot. If the opponent has a spell that's going to make the 2/1 bigger next turn, then you're pretty much in bad shape anyway. So I would just play I like how Cal says Machinist. I like that. I say Machinist. I don't know if that's wrong or whatever, but I just play that this turn. I get and hope for next turn to make mine a big one, So then you can hold the board. You got to take some damage this turn, but that's the only way I think you can win this, pretty much. So that's what I do. I play the 2/1 and then wait it out a turn, and then hope I can make it a 6/6 next turn, or at least you can heed Distillation next turn, and then I don't know actually how that works. Would it be a 7/7 or a 5/5 if you?
5/5.
It would be a
Yeah.
5/5 if you cheapen the.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean that would draw you some more gas potentially, and then at that point they're not really going to attack into a big unit unless they have a spell of their own. But if they do, you're pretty much hosed anyways. So that's what I would do.
I'm usually a really big fan of playing around things that I think my opponent will play. The only reason I didn't consider it here is because, like in both scenarios, like so if we Distillation, this turn, he gets to deal 15 damage to us, and we will gain the 1 life, so we'll go to or 8. Yeah, was that after getting the life? Yeah, we'll be at 8 or 9. So then the next turn they'll probably have lethal at some way. And yeah,
And we can do what, like play just disappear if we got lucky and drew a time.
Yeah. So I think it is a dire spot, and I do like playing around stuff, but I think in this specific spot I might not. But I think that's a very legitimate line too. That's a line that I was thinking about as well.
All right. So it looks like playing the battery mage here takes it 3 to 1-1. So very impressive. Let us know. Yeah, it's really tough when you're in that kind of rock and a hard spot where it's like we know there's a high probability to have something. We want to play around it, but because of the board presence, we just essentially can't.
Well, here's something to consider. The opponent's probably been attacking with this Mag Stranger, which means their 5-cost spell is like a 3-cost spell now.
Yeah,
They might not have the big spell to play because it's shrunk. That's a good point.
I also considered that they obviously have the power to play a 5-cost spell and kill the herbalist and get in with the apprentice mage that turn, and instead they're choosing to play the 2/1 instead, which probably means they're setting up for a 5-cost spell, but also kind of gives some glimmer of hope that their Mag Stranger has reduced the cost of stuff and they don't have it, and they're just playing their 2/1 instead. So maybe they don't.
Like, they're clearly in that deck, but hopefully this Mag Stranger's messing up their plans.
we'll keep our fingers crossed. If it was any of you guys, I'd probably say that, but I know my luck. So they have 2 5-cost spells sitting in their hand, just waiting to wreck my day.
It's
gun down 1 and gun down 2.
You said that you did win this game.
No, I think I lost this one. They had the 3. It was the seed, so they killed my battery mage, swung in for 5, and things just went downhill after that.
Yeah.
All right, so that's our what's the play for the week, which takes us to our final segment, which is our constructed corner. So first off, though, we do have another ECQ coming down this weekend. It is ECQ Festival of Inspirations. John, would you like to give our listeners the breakdown on that one, please?
Sure. So this is coming up very soon. By the time this podcast comes out, just a couple days away, the same weekend, August 21st through 23rd. It's just a standard ECQ, which is like the big monthly tournaments that Direwolf does for this game Eternal. And they rotate between the 2 formats, Expedition and Throne, and this one is Expedition. So basically you just show up when the tournament starts Friday afternoon. It's August 21st, 10 a.m. MDT, which is 16 UTC. And it goes through Saturday, August 22nd at 4 MDT or 22 UTC. And you just bring your, what you think is your best or your favorite Expedition deck. You play 28 games, win or lose. You try to get the best record possible. And you're trying to qualify for Worlds and win some cash prizes and stuff by doing well in this tournament, basically. And they do tournament coverage on Sunday. Let's see here if I see what time that starts. There you go. So the finals. Sunday, the 23rd, starts at 11 a.m. Mountain Time or 17 UTC. And so that's for the top 64 players for that first day's tournament. And whoever gets first gets $1,000, 32 packs, and an invite to Worlds. So should be exciting. There's always extra sweet Twitch drops for watching the coverage, and it's usually good anyway. So I recommend participating if you feel like it, or watching if you don't.
Couple of things to add on there. All the participants of the tournament will earn 3 alternate art copies of At Any Cost, which is the legendary 3-cost fast spell that deals 3 damage, or if you have 12, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 12 Shadow Influence, it deals 12 damage instead. IP Longno took it to a 2nd place finish a couple of weeks ago on the Summer Challenge. And then for day 1, if you get the max points you can get, or max packs you can get, if you get 15 wins, or I'm sorry, at the very least, if you go 0 or 1 wins on day 1, you get 28 packs. And if you go any record over 15 wins or greater, you get 40 packs. And of course, it is 28 games total, win or lose. So definitely something to be on the lookout, both on whether you're competitive or just want to test out a deck, or just want some decent value for your gems or gold.
Yeah, you get a sweet card back just for signing up for the tournament as well.
Yeah, there you go. It's all Vara themed here.
I was gonna ask what you guys thought about the card back. I really like this one. The shimmering effect on it is pretty nice. I think this might be my default one for a bit.
The animation looks really nice on the website. Like, I imagine it'll just look better in game, so I'm pretty excited for it. I like the, the clean animated look.
Yeah, huge fan.
I don't think it's gonna take overthrow my Airmont ones, but yeah, it definitely doesn't look like it's gonna disappoint like the lava one did. The lava one I thought was gonna look so good in game, and it just didn't.
Yeah, you really can't say for sure until you see it in game. Like, as far as sometimes they just don't quite look the same on the website, like better or worse.
Not gonna lie, I love my cosmetics setup, so I'm not even gonna touch this one.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. Okay, so this week's deck, once again, I try to change it up, and we've talked about a couple of competitive decks here recently. So this one is going to send it back over to Gauntlet, which the creator has seen some success on ladder with it. So don't feel afraid, or don't be afraid to run it and in the ladder and see how you do. It drew me to it because, one, it was on Eternal Warcry, but two, the fact that it is a Roland Iron Tyrant deck, and I love that card. So any deck that lets me play that card, I'm going to test it out. This is an even Argenport deck constructed by Steel Chucker 3, which currently took them to a 49-0 winning streak in Gauntlet. So the cost of the deck is 34,500 Shiftstone, not including campaign cards, so that there are quite a few on here. Just something to keep in mind. And breaking down the list very quickly, it's 4 Annihilate, 4 Blight Moth, 4 Defile, 2 Devour, 4 Even-Handed Golem, 4 Just Desserts, 2 Petition, 3 Reweave, 4 Rip Knife Assassin, 4 Roland Iron Tyrant, 3 Vara Vengeance Seeker, 4 Wasteland Broker, 4 Akaria First Reaper, 4 Storm Halt Knife, Justice Sigil, Shadow Sigil, 4 Argenport Banner, 4 Argenport Silex, 4 Argenport Insignia, 4 Crest of Vengeance, 3 Justice Symbols, 4 Shadow Symbols, with a market including Immortalize, Burglarize, Cleansing Rain, Null Blade, and Silver Blade Menace. So not much here that to really break down. I mean, it's just straight value. You're using Reweave to cash in your Blight Moth and your Rip Knives to go draw the Even-Handed Golems to draw more cards. That's pretty much the biggest thing here. You can use your Varas to cash them in for a Roland or Wasteland Broker, or vice versa. Pretty much just getting Roll on the board to kill stuff, and then Akaria is your top end, with a market to just adjust on any other things that the computer's trying to do. Computer's never going to play around with just the desserts, so that's a pretty good removal spell that combos very well with Roland. And of course, there's currently a bug right now with Roland and Just Desserts, where if you block a unit with Roland and you Just Desserts it, the unit will take damage twice, i.e. hitting itself as well as taking the damage from Roland. And for some reason, the AI computes that as it dying twice, and you'll get 2 Valkyries out of it. So it works in Constructed as well for you exploiters out there, but just something to keep in mind. The deck just seems fun. Like I said, I put it on here. They had a really good winning streak with it. I have not played that many games with the deck yet, nor do I think I'm going to do that much in Gauntlet until I get the quest for it. But Roland Tyrant, if you guys have not played with him, he is an absolute blast to play with. Every time your unit, or one of your opponent's units dies, you get a 1/1 Deadly Valkyrie. Once you have 1 Valkyrie, that thing can block all day because it makes another one when it happens. Roland keeps getting bigger, becomes a win con on its own. It's just a ton of fun. John, you're high on Roland as well. You have anything else to add?
He's definitely a safe craft. I'm not surprised to see him in this 49-0 gauntlet deck. Like the AI just doesn't really know what to do with them, and eventually they'll just kind of attack into one of your like you say, deadly flyers, and it just replaces itself. Like the AI just doesn't comprehend any of that. So yeah, this doesn't surprise me that this is a very strong gauntlet deck. It looks good to me.
Yeah. And once again, the strategy is sound for constructed as well. If you guys want to take this as a shell of a deck and make some modifications to fit your own constructed.
There's some good decks with Roland on Warcry. So
yeah, it's just really good. It doesn't take much for Roland to run away with the game. It really doesn't. All right, well, that is our constructed corner for the week. Thank you again, Steel Chucker, for sharing this deck with us. And hopefully we'll see some of you people in ladder just smash it and get to masters, because I know some of you have been working your way up. I'm very proud of you guys, so keep it going. But time to start wrapping things up. Sakarnen, thank you so much for being on the show, man. Really appreciate your insight. Great member of the team and the community. You're a mod for, I think, half of Twitch. So where can people find you at?
First of all, it's kind of funny. But yeah, you could probably find me just in Jedi's Discord. I'm usually there. I guess I technically have a Twitter, but yeah, I mean, I don't really stream or anything. So you can find me in game, Sakarnen. You can find me on Twitch as Darthanos, or you could probably find me in a Discord server somewhere.
All right, and good luck on your private pilot's license test this week.
Thank you.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with all 80 of our listeners to share some love or send some good vibes your way. Cal, other than calling out all my punts, thank you so much for being on the show, buddy. Really do appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule and staying up super late to be on the show and sharing your insight with us. Thanks again. Where can people find you at?
On ladder, fight me. No, I spend time in the EternalJourney Discord. Other than that, I'm not a huge social media persona. I'm always happy to sort of talk Eternal in game. I'm meet me on ladder and want to add me in game in chat. Then, as long as you can bear with my slow responses on mobile, I'm always happy to chat. Other than that, join the Discord. Come say hi.
I will say that Cal is very active in the Discord, absolutely phenomenal about helping people out with their brews and sharing things and working out theories. So if you definitely need some deck assistance, Cal is going to be the one that's going to be on top of it 100%, as well as Sakarnen. That's the reason why they were on the show this time. You guys can catch us live at twitch.tv/Jedi_EJ every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday. You can catch us offline at EternalJourney on YouTube, where you also get the video version of this podcast and various draft videos and tutorials and whatnot. They mentioned the Discord, of course, where you can talk to us 24/7. Even if it is at a slight delay, you can get the link in the show notes down below. Alex, John, thank you guys so much for being on the show. As always, I don't understand how you put up with me week after week, but I do appreciate it. Special thank you to all the ongoing support from our listeners, viewers, and the people that sub to the channel and donate and hang out in the Discord and just really keep pushing this community to higher levels of vibration. You guys are phenomenal. But that's going to do it for us this time. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Until next time, as always, happy gaming.
Bye.
Ta-ta.
Thank you. Good luck in your draft queues, everyone.